I pulled over on Highway 31, hands shaking, as I stared at the text message that changed everything I thought I knew about my father. The funeral was in 2 hours, and I'd been driving for 6 straight hours from Chicago to Millbrook, Michigan, rehearsing the cold politeness I'd use with my family. But this message, this one simple text from my brother Jake, made me question whether I should even show up at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rain drummed against my windshield like accusations, each drop a reminder of the 12 years I'd stayed away. 12 years since I'd walked out of Thompson Auto Repair for the last time, my father's words still burning in my ears. Art doesn't pay bills, Maya. Dreams don't fix engines. I'd been 22 then, fresh out of college with a graphic design degree and a head full of impossible plans. He'd been 53, already showing the first signs of the emphysema that would eventually claim him, though none of us knew it then. The argument that changed everything started over breakfast on a Tuesday morning in October. I remember, because the maple tree outside our kitchen window had just started turning red, and Mom was making her famous blueberry pancakes, the ones that always meant she was trying to soften bad news. Dad sat across from me at the same wooden table where we'd eaten every meal for 20 years, his coffee growing cold as he stared at the job application I'd left on the counter the night before. Creative director at Morrison Graphics, he read aloud, his voice flat as hammered steel. In Chicago, he looked up at me then, his blue eyes the same shade as mine, but harder somehow, worn down by decades of grease stains and early mornings. You know what your problem is, Maya? You think the world owes you something just because you can draw pretty pictures. I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest, the same anger that had been building for months every time he dismissed my work as a hobby instead of a career. They're not just pretty pictures, Dad, it's visual communication. It's about helping businesses tell their stories, connect with people. It matters, he laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want to know what matters? Keeping the lights on. Putting food on the table. Your grandfather built this shop with his bare hands during the Depression, and I've spent 30 years making sure it survives. That's what matters. That's legacy. And what if I don't want your legacy? The words came out sharper than I intended, cutting through the morning air like a blade. Mom stopped stirring the pancake batter, her wooden spoon frozen mid-circle. Dad's face went white, then red, then something close to purple. Then you're not the daughter I raised, he said quietly, and those 7 words shattered something between us that I thought could never be broken. You walk out that door to chase fairy tales in the big city, you don't come back. I won't have quitters in this family. I stood up so fast my chair toppled backward, clattering against the linoleum floor. Fine, I said, though my voice was barely a whisper. Then I guess I'm not your daughter anymore. I was packed and gone by noon, 3 suitcases and a box of art supplies loaded into my beat-up Honda Civic. Mom hugged me at the door, her tears soaking into my shoulder, but Dad stayed in the shop, the steady rhythm of his hammer echoing across the yard like a heartbeat that refused to sync with mine. Jake, then only 17, stood at his bedroom window, watching me leave with eyes that held questions I couldn't answer. Chicago welcomed me like a cold embrace, all steel and glass and possibilities that seemed infinite from the 20th floor of my tiny studio apartment. Morrison Graphics hired me within a week, impressed by the portfolio I'd spent 4 years building, and the recommendation letter from Professor Martinez, the only teacher who'd ever really understood what I was trying to create. The work was everything I dreamed it would be, challenging and creative and purposeful in ways that fixing carburetors could never be. But success has a way of feeling hollow when there's no one to share it with. I sent photos of my first published campaign to Mom's email, a series of ads for a local animal shelter that helped them increase adoptions by 40%. She wrote back with 3 words. Very nice, honey. No mention of whether Dad had seen them. No mention of Dad at all. The years blurred together like time-lapse photography, each season bringing new clients, new challenges, new awards that I accepted with practiced smiles and speeches about creative vision. I dated Marcus, a fellow designer with kind eyes and steady hands, for 3 years before we realized we were better as colleagues than lovers. I bought a condo in Lincoln Park, the kind of place I dreamed about during those long Michigan winters, all exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows that let in light from every direction. I told myself I was happy. I told myself I didn't miss the smell of motor oil and coffee that always clung to Dad's work shirts, or the way Mom hummed old Motown songs while she cooked dinner, or Jake's terrible jokes that somehow always made me laugh despite myself. I told myself a lot of things that weren't entirely true. Mom called every few months, always on Sunday afternoons when she knew I'd be home, usually doing laundry or meal prep for the week ahead. Our conversations followed the same careful script, dancing around the empty space where Dad should have been mentioned. She'd tell me about the neighbors, about Jake's job at the high school teaching history, about the weather and the price of groceries and anything else that didn't require us to acknowledge the elephant in the room. "How's work?" she'd always ask, and I'd give her the sanitized version, the highlights reel that made my life sound full and meaningful and complete. I never told her about the nights I'd lie awake wondering if I'd made the right choice, if success was worth the price I'd paid for it. I never told her that sometimes, when I smelled WD-40 or heard the distant sound of tools clattering in someone's garage, I felt homesick for a place that no longer existed. Jake graduated high school, then college, then started teaching without me there to see any of it. Mom sent pictures occasionally, digital snapshots that arrived in my inbox like postcards from a foreign country. Jake in his cap and gown, grinning at the camera with Dad's arm around his shoulders. Jake at his wedding to a sweet-faced woman named Beth, Dad's proud smile visible even from across the church. Jake holding his newborn daughter Emma, 3 generations of Thompsons crowded into one frame, the empty space where I should have been obvious to anyone who looked closely enough. I sent gifts for birthdays and holidays, always expensive and thoughtful, and ordered online to avoid the intimacy of shopping in person. A professional-grade tool set for Dad's 60th birthday, though I never knew if he kept it or threw it away. A custom photo album for Mom filled with pictures I'd found on social media, moments from my life that she'd never been part of but somehow deserved.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
To see. A savings bond for Emma's college fund, because even from a distance I wanted to be the aunt who invested in her future. The shop changed over the years, according to the snippets Mom shared during our careful conversations. They'd expanded into the building next door, hired 2 full-time mechanics, and an office manager named Mrs. Peterson, who made coffee strong enough to strip paint. Dad had finally computerized the inventory system, something he'd resisted for years because he claimed he could remember every part they'd ever ordered just by looking at the shelves. Business was good, she said. Steady. The kind of success that built slowly and lasted. I tried not to think about whether he ever regretted the ultimatum he'd given me, whether he'd softened with age the way some fathers do when they realize their children are adults with their own dreams and disappointments. I tried not to wonder if he ever looked at my work online, if Mom had shown him the articles about the campaigns I'd designed, or the industry awards I'd won. I tried not to care whether he was proud of me, but trying not to care and actually not caring are different things entirely. The call came on a Wednesday morning in March, just after I'd finished presenting a rebrand concept to a client who made organic dog treats and had strong opinions about font choices. I was gathering my materials, feeling the familiar high of a successful pitch, when my phone buzzed with Mom's number. She never called during the workday, never interrupted my schedule, so I knew before I answered that something was wrong. "Maya." Her voice was small and broken, like something precious that had been dropped and couldn't be fixed. "It's your father. He's gone." The words hit me like cold water, shocking and immediate and impossible to process. "What do you mean gone?" "Heart attack. This morning around 8:30. He was in the shop, working on Mrs. Daniels' transmission, and Eddie found him." She dissolved into tears then, the kind of crying that sounds like drowning, and I stood frozen in Morrison Graphics' sleek conference room, surrounded by mood boards and color swatches while my world tilted sideways. "I'll be there," I heard myself say, though I couldn't remember making the decision to speak. "I'll be there as soon as I can." The drive from Chicago to Millbrook takes about 6 hours if you follow the speed limit and stop for gas and food like a reasonable person. I made it in 4.5, pushing my car and my nerves to their limits, while classic rock played softly from the radio, the same stations Dad used to listen to while he worked. Every song seemed chosen specifically to hurt me, guitar solos that reminded me of summer afternoons when I'd sit in the shop doing homework while he hummed along to Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd, back when we existed in the same world and spoke the same language. Millbrook hadn't changed much in 12 years, still the kind of small town where everyone knows everyone else's business, and the biggest excitement is usually the high school football team making it to regionals. Main Street looked exactly the same, a collection of family-owned businesses and empty storefronts that spoke to both the stubborn persistence and quiet decline of places like this. Thompson Auto Repair sat on the corner of Main and Cedar, the same blue and white sign Dad had installed when I was in middle school, now faded but still readable from 3 blocks away. I didn't stop there, I couldn't. Not yet. Instead, I drove straight to the house on Maple Street, the same Victorian where I'd grown up, where my bedroom on the 2nd floor still held the faded outline of posters I'd taken down before I left for college. Mom's car was in the driveway, along with Jake's truck and 2 others I didn't recognize, probably belonging to neighbors or church friends who'd come to help with the arrangements. The front door opened before I could knock, and Jake stood there looking older than I remembered, but still unmistakably my little brother, his dark hair now receding slightly at the temples and his face carrying the weight of someone who'd just lost his hero. We stared at each other for a long moment, 12 years of distance and silence, stretching between us like a canyon, neither of us knew how to cross. "Maya," he said finally, and his voice cracked on my name like he was 17 again. Then he was hugging me, his arms strong and familiar and desperate, and I realized I was crying without remembering when the tears had started. "I'm sorry," I whispered into his shoulder, "I'm so sorry I wasn't here." "You're here now," he said, and there was forgiveness in his voice that I didn't deserve. "That's what matters." Mom appeared in the hallway behind him, smaller than I remembered and aged in ways that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with worry. Her hair was more gray than brown now, and her face was puffy from crying, but her eyes were the same warm hazel that had comforted me through nightmares and heartbreaks and the ordinary disappointments of growing up. "My baby," she said, reaching for me with hands that trembled slightly. "My baby came home." We held each other in the doorway, 3 people who'd spent 12 years pretending we were okay with being incomplete, and for the first time since I'd left, I felt like I might actually be home instead of just visiting the place where I used to live. The house smelled like casseroles and coffee, and the lavender sachets Mom had always kept in the linen closets, familiar scents that pulled me back through the years like time travel. Nothing had changed much, which somehow made everything feel different. My senior portrait still hung in the hallway next to Jake's, though mine looked strangely formal and distant now, like a photograph of someone I used to know but had lost touch with over the years. "The funeral's tomorrow," Mom said as we settled into the living room, the same floral print sofa where we'd watch Saturday morning cartoons and Christmas specials, and countless Detroit Tigers games. 2 o'clock at St. Mary South's, then graveside at Millbrook Cemetery. I know it's short notice, but with his heart, we didn't expect. She couldn't finish the sentence, and Jake reached over to squeeze her hand. The whole town's going to be there, he said to me. Dad touched a lot of lives, fixed a lot of cars, helped a lot of people. You'd be surprised how many folks he gave credit to when they couldn't pay cash, or how many times he'd show up at someone's house on a Sunday to help with a breakdown. I nodded, though hearing about Dad's kindness to everyone except me felt like swallowing glass. What can I do? How can I help? Just being here helps, Mom said, but there was something in her voice, a hesitation that made me think there was more she wanted to say but couldn't quite bring herself to voice. That evening, after the neighbors had gone home, and the casserole dishes had been sorted and refrigerated, Jake and I sat on the back porch drinking beer, and watching the sun set over the same cornfield where we'd played hide and seek as kids. The silence between us was comfortable now, the kind that comes from shared history and mutual grief, but I could tell he was working up to something important. Maya, he said finally, peeling the label off his beer bottle with careful precision, there's something you should know about Dad. About why he was so hard on you. I tensed, not sure I was ready for revelations or explanations or anything that might complicate the straightforward narrative of resentment I'd been carrying for 12 years. Jake, you don't have to. Yeah, I do. He looked at me directly then, his expression serious in a way that reminded me of Dad at his most stubborn. He kept everything, Maya. Every article about your work, every award announcement, every picture Mom could find online. He had a whole box of them in his office at the shop, behind his desk where he'd see them every day. The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs and making the world tilt sideways. What are you talking about? The Morrison Graphics website, the design magazines, the local business journal article about young professionals making an impact in Chicago. He printed all of it. Hell, he probably knew more about your career than you thought he did. Jake's voice was gentle but insistent, like he was trying to perform surgery with words. He was proud of you, Maya. He just didn't know how to say it without admitting he was wrong. I stared at him, trying to process this information that rearranged everything I thought I understood about the last 12 years. Then why didn't he call? Why didn't he ever reach out? Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle high above the cornfield. Because he was Robert Thompson, he said finally. And Robert Thompson didn't apologize, didn't admit mistakes, didn't show weakness. It was his greatest strength and his worst flaw, rolled into one stubborn package. We sat in silence as the sun disappeared behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of childhood summers when the world seemed infinite and forgiving. I thought about the box of articles Jake had described, imagining Dad sitting in his office during lunch breaks, reading about my successes while pretending they didn't matter to him. The image was so vivid and so heartbreaking that I had to put my beer down before I dropped it. There's more, Jake said quietly, and something in his tone made me look at him sharply. After you left, he changed the shop's logo. Hired a design firm from Grand Rapids to create something more modern, more professional. Spent a fortune on it, way more than he needed to. So the design firm was run by one of your professors from college. Professor Martinez, Dad called him, asked specifically about your work, about whether you had what it took to make it in the real world. Jake smiled sadly. Martinez told him, you were the most talented student he'd ever taught, that you were going to do incredible things if you got the chance. Dad never told anyone about that conversation, but I overheard him talking to Mom about it one night. He said he was afraid he'd been holding you back, that maybe the best thing he could do was let you go. The revelation hit me like lightning, illuminating 12 years of misunderstood motivations in a single brilliant flash. The ultimatum hadn't been about control or disappointment or even anger. It had been about love, twisted and poorly expressed and completely misguided, but love nonetheless. Dad had pushed me away because he thought that's what I needed, not because he didn't want me to succeed. Why didn't you tell me this before? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Because I was 17 and didn't understand it myself until years later. And then after a while, it seemed like you'd moved on, built this amazing life, and maybe bringing up the past would just hurt everyone involved. Jake finished his beer and set the empty bottle on the porch railing. But now he's gone, and you're here, and I couldn't let you think he didn't love you. Because he did, Maya. He loved you so much it made him stupid. That night, I lay in my old bedroom, staring at the ceiling where I'd once stuck glow-in-the-dark stars in elaborate constellations. The bed was the same twin size I'd slept in through high school, and my feet hung off the end now, but somehow it still felt like the safest place in the world. I thought about Dad keeping that box of articles, about him asking Professor Martinez about my potential, about the years of silence that had been filled with more love than I'd ever imagined possible. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a text message, the sound sharp and intrusive in the quiet house. I almost ignored it, thinking it was probably work or one of my Chicago friends sending condolences, but something made me reach for it anyway. The message was from Jake, sent just minutes earlier. Found something in Dad's toolbox today. A letter with your name on it. Dated 3 months ago. Should I bring it over now or wait until after the funeral? I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. A letter. With my name on it. Written 3 months ago, which meant Dad had been thinking about me, planning to reach out, maybe even ready to bridge the gap between us that had seemed impossibly wide for so long. I typed back quickly. Now please. Jake arrived 20 minutes later, still wearing the same clothes from dinner, carrying a small manila envelope that looked like it had been handled many times, the edges soft and slightly worn. He handed it to me without ceremony, kissed the top of my head like he used to when we were kids, and left me alone with whatever Dad had wanted to say. The envelope was addressed in Dad's careful handwriting. For Maya Thompson, my daughter when the time is right. I turned it over in my hands several times, afraid to open it and equally afraid not to. Finally I slid my finger under the flap, and pulled out 2 sheets of lined paper covered in the same meticulous script. My dear Maya. It began, and I had to stop reading immediately, because seeing those words in his handwriting made everything real in a way that nothing else had. He was really gone, and this letter was all I would ever have of his voice again. Part 2. The letter's revelation. My dear Maya, the letter began, and I had to set it down on my nightstand, my hands trembling too much to hold the paper steady. The familiar slant of Dad's handwriting blurred through my tears, each carefully formed letter a reminder that he'd taken time to choose his words, to say what he'd never been able to speak aloud. I picked it up again, forcing myself to continue reading. I'm writing this because Dr. Hamilton says my heart isn't as strong as it used to be, and there are things that need saying before it's too late. Things I should have said 12 years ago, when you walked out that door with your head held high, and your dreams tucked under your arm like a blueprint for a life I was too scared to understand. I was wrong, Maya. Not about loving you, never about that, but about everything else. About what success looks like, about what legacy means, about what a father's job really is. I thought I was supposed to keep you safe, to steer you toward the kind of solid, dependable life that I understood. I thought dreams were luxuries that people like us couldn't afford, dangerous distractions that would leave you disappointed and broke, and wishing you'd listen to your old man. But Jake showed me your work last month. Not just the pictures on your company's website, but the real work, the campaigns that helped that animal shelter find homes for dogs that would have been put down, the small business logos that helped families keep their doors open during the pandemic, the nonprofit materials that raised money for kids who needed medical care their parents couldn't afford. That's not just art, honey. That's changing the world, one design at a time. I kept every article about you, every mention in those design magazines, every photograph I could find online. I have them in a box in my office, and sometimes when the day gets long, and my back starts aching from bending over engines, I pull them out and look at them and feel something I didn't know I had a name for until recently. Pride, Maya. Pure, uncomplicated pride in the daughter who was brave enough to chase something bigger than what I offered her. I called Professor Martinez a few weeks after you left, told him I needed to know if I'd made a mistake, if I'd pushed away something precious because I was too stubborn to see its value. He said you were the most naturally gifted student he'd ever taught, that you had this rare ability to see what people needed before they knew they needed it themselves. He said you were going to change the industry, not just survive in it, but transform it into something better. I hung up that phone, and sat in my office for 2 hours, staring at the wall and realizing I'd just spent 12 years being proud of the wrong things. I was proud of keeping the shop running, of maintaining what my father built, of providing steady work for good people in a town that doesn't have many opportunities. Those aren't small things, but they're not everything either. You took the creativity I never knew how to value, and turned it into something that matters in ways I'm still learning to understand. The shop's doing well, better than it ever has. Jake's been helping with the books since he finished college, and he's got ideas about expanding into custom restoration work, maybe even classic car shows and collector events. He's got your eye for seeing possibilities where other people just see problems. Eddie thinks we should bring in one of those computerized diagnostic machines, and Mrs. Peterson has been after me for years to update our customer database system. Change doesn't scare me the way it used to, but none of that success feels complete without you here to see it, to add your perspective to our family conversations, to help us figure out what comes next. I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything after the way I handled things, but I'm asking anyway. Come home, Maya. Not to stay, not to give up the life you've built, but to visit, to let us see who you've become, to help us understand the world you're creating out there. Your mother misses you every single day. She tries to hide it, but I catch her sometimes looking at your picture on the mantel with this expression like she's seeing a ghost of all the conversations we should have had, all the holidays and birthdays and ordinary Sundays we lost, because I was too proud to admit I was wrong. Jake talks about you constantly, tells anyone who'll listen about his sister, the successful designer in Chicago, but I can see the sadness in his eyes when he realizes you don't know about his daughter Emma's first steps, or the way she laughs when he reads her the same story we used to read to you. I've started this letter 17 times over the past 3 months, always finding reasons to throw it away before I finished. Too sentimental, too little too late, too many words that could never undo 12 years of silence. But Dr. Hamilton's latest test results changed my perspective on what I can and can't afford to leave unsaid. Life is shorter than we think it is, and love is too important to waste on pride. I don't expect forgiveness, though I hope for it. I don't expect you to move back to Millbrook and take over the shop, though you're welcome to if that's what you want. I expect nothing except the chance to tell you that I love you, that I've always loved you, and that walking away from you was the biggest mistake of my life. There's something else in the toolbox, something I've been saving for you since the day you left, your grandfather's compass, the one he carried in World War II, and gave to me when I took over the shop. It doesn't point north anymore, hasn't for years, but it still reminds me that sometimes you have to trust your own sense of direction even when all the instruments say you're going the wrong way. You had that kind of courage at 22, and I was too frightened of losing you to see that letting you go was the only way to keep you. If you're reading this, it probably means I'm gone, and you're home for reasons that have nothing to do with reconciliation and everything to do with duty. I'm sorry for that timing, sorrier than I can express that we lost so many years to my stubbornness. But I'm not sorry you left, Maya. I'm not sorry you chose your dreams over my fears. I'm not sorry you became exactly who you were meant to be. Come see me at the shop sometime. If you can stand it. Bring your sketchbook. Show me how you see the world now. Help me understand what I was too scared to learn when it mattered most. All my love. All my pride, all my regret. Dad. P.S. The new logo Jake mentioned came from Morrison Graphics. I told them I wanted something that honored the past, but pointed toward the future, something that would make my daughter proud if she ever saw it. They delivered exactly what I asked for. I read the letter 3 times before I could process what it really meant, before I could absorb the magnitude of what I'd lost and found simultaneously. Dad had been reaching toward me for months, maybe years, building bridges I hadn't known existed while I'd been nursing wounds that had already begun healing in ways I couldn't see from Chicago. The mention of Morrison Graphics hit me like lightning. They'd never told me about a client in Millbrook, never mentioned Thompson Auto Repair, but then again, I'd worked on dozens of accounts and couldn't possibly know every small project that came through the office. Dad had hired my own company to design his new logo, had probably hoped I'd be assigned to the project, had wanted to support my work, even if he couldn't support it directly. I pulled out my laptop and searched for Thompson Auto Repair online, finding their website updated with a clean, modern logo that balanced traditional automotive imagery with contemporary typography. It was good work, professional and appealing, the kind of design that honored history while embracing progress. Someone at Morrison had understood the assignment perfectly, had captured exactly what Dad described in his letter. The timestamp on the website showed the logo had been implemented 8 months ago, which meant Dad had been planning this reconciliation longer than he'd admitted in his letter. He'd been laying groundwork, creating connections, building a foundation for conversations we'd never had the chance to finish. Sleep was impossible after reading the letter. I sat by my bedroom window, watching the familiar streets of my childhood neighborhood under the orange glow of streetlights, thinking about all the assumptions I'd made about Dad's silence over the years. I'd interpreted his lack of contact as indifference, his absence from my life as evidence that he'd meant what he said about not having quitters in the family. But the letter revealed a completely different story, one where silence had been a form of respect rather than rejection, where distance had been a gift he'd given me even though it cost him everything. Around 3 in the morning, I crept downstairs to the kitchen, moving quietly through the house where I'd learned to walk and talk and dream about futures that seemed impossible from a small town in northern Michigan. The kitchen looked exactly the same as it had 12 years ago, same yellow paint on the walls, same round table where we'd eaten thousands of meals together, same coffee maker that Dad had programmed to start brewing every morning at 5:30 sharp. I made coffee in that familiar machine, muscle memory guiding me through the routine of measuring grounds and adding water, and sat at the table where Dad had delivered his ultimatum all those years ago. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the window when Mom appeared in the doorway, wearing the same terry cloth robe she'd had since I was in high school. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, settling into the chair across from me, the same seat Dad had occupied during that final argument. "Jake gave me Dad's letter," I said, my voice hoarse from crying and exhaustion. Mom nodded, unsurprised. "He wrote it after his first appointment with Dr. Hamilton. Kept revising it, adding things, taking things out. He wanted to get it perfect. Wanted to say exactly what he meant without saying too much." She smiled sadly. "That was your father, always worried about finding the right words even when no words would have been enough. Why didn't he send it?" "He was going to, after Christmas," he said. "He wanted to give you time to get through the holidays, didn't want to disrupt your life during what he thought might be a busy season at work." She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "He had it all planned out. The letter first, then maybe a phone call if you responded well, then an invitation to visit if you were willing. He was going to take it slow, give you all the control, let you decide how much contact you wanted." The irony was devastating. Dad had been planning a reunion while I'd been planning my annual avoidance of anything related to home and family. I'd spent Christmas alone in my Chicago condo, telling myself I preferred the quiet solitude to the complications of family dynamics, while he'd been here writing and rewriting a letter designed to bring me home. "I saw the Morrison Graphics logo on the shop's website," I said. Mom's smile was the first genuine one I'd seen from her since I'd arrived. "He was so proud of that project. printed out copies of the design specs and carried them around in his wallet for weeks, showing them to anyone who'd listen. "My daughter's company did this," he'd say. "Aren't they talented? I didn't even know about it. Morrison handles so many accounts and I work mostly on the bigger campaigns. Someone else would have designed it." He knew that, but it didn't matter to him. He said it was like hiring you by proxy, like having a little piece of your talent working for the family business even if you weren't here to see it. Mom's eyes filled with tears. He loved that logo, Maya. Every time someone complimented it, every time a customer mentioned how professional it looked, he'd get this expression like he'd won the lottery. We sat in comfortable silence as the sun rose higher, painting the kitchen in the same golden light I remembered from childhood mornings when Dad would be getting ready for work, and I'd be rushing to finish homework I'd put off until the last minute. The normalcy of the moment felt surreal against the backdrop of grief and revelation, like visiting a museum exhibit of my own life. "What happens now?" I asked eventually. "Now we bury your father, and then we figure out how to be a family again," Mom said simply. "If that's what you want." Part 3. Returning to the workshop. The funeral was everything Dad would have hated and exactly what he deserved. Mary's Catholic Church was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the vestibule, all of them gathered to honor a man who'd touched their lives in ways both practical and profound. Father Mackenzie, who'd known Dad since they were altar boys together 50 years ago, delivered a homily that captured the essence of Robert Thompson, without romanticizing his rough edges or pretending he'd been perfect. I sat in the front pew between Mom and Jake, wearing the only black dress I'd brought with me, trying to process the sheer number of people who'd come to say goodbye. Former customers told stories about Dad fixing their cars for the cost of parts when money was tight, about him showing up at their houses on Christmas Eve to help with a breakdown, about the way he'd taught their teenagers basic auto maintenance so they wouldn't get stranded or taken advantage of by unscrupulous mechanics. Mrs. Daniels, whose transmission Dad had been working on when he died, stood up during the time for sharing and told the congregation that he'd refused payment for a repair 3 months earlier because her husband had just lost his job. "Bob Thompson fixed more than cars," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed church. "He fixed problems, he fixed situations, and sometimes he fixed hearts that were breaking from worry about how to keep their families safe on the road." Jake delivered the main eulogy, speaking about Dad's devotion to family and community, his work ethic that bordered on legendary, and his quiet generosity that he'd never wanted publicized. He talked about the man who'd taught him to change oil, and check tire pressure, and treat every customer's problem like it was the most important thing in the world, who'd built a business on reputation and fairness, and the radical idea that honest work deserved honest pay. "Dad wasn't a man of many words," Jake said, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. "But every word he spoke, he meant. Every promise he made, he kept. Every person he committed to helping, he helped. He measured success not by what he accumulated, but by what he contributed, not by what he achieved for himself, but by what he made possible for others." I wanted to stand up and tell them about the letter, about the box of articles, about the Morrison Graphics logo, and the years of silent pride he'd carried like a secret treasure. I wanted to share the revelation that his harsh words 12 years ago had come from love, not anger, from fear of holding me back rather than disappointment in who I was becoming. But the words stayed locked in my throat, too personal and too precious to offer to a crowd of people who'd already known the best parts of Dad without needing explanation. The graveside service was smaller, limited to family and close friends, conducted under a gray March sky that threatened snow but held back its tears until we were finished. Uncle Eddie, Dad's younger brother who'd always been the family rebel, spoke about their childhood adventures and the way Dad had looked after him when their parents died young, how he'd stepped into the role of protector and provider before he was old enough to vote. "Bob never did anything halfway," Eddie said, his gruff voice softened by emotion. "When he loved you, you knew it. When he was disappointed in you, you knew that too. But the love was always stronger than the disappointment, always deeper than whatever surface problems might have gotten in the way. As the crowd began to disperse, Eddie approached me with something in his weathered hands. "Your dad asked me to give you this when the time came," he said, pressing a small brass key into my palm. "Said it opens something that's been waiting for you." The key was warm from Eddie's pocket, small and unremarkable except for the tiny engraving along its edge. "Maya's workshop." I stared at it, confused and curious, while Eddie smiled with the expression of someone who'd been keeping a good secret for a long time. "Workshop?" I asked. "Behind the shop, past the main garage bays. He's been working on it for about 2 years, ever since Jake told him you'd gotten that promotion to creative director. Said every artist needs a proper studio, and it was past time his daughter had one." Eddie's eyes twinkled with mischief and affection. "Course, he also said if you never came home, he'd turn it into a place to restore classic motorcycles, so it wasn't like he was wasting the space." I closed my fingers around the key, feeling its weight and significance. Dad had built me a workshop. While I'd been in Chicago assuming he'd forgotten I existed, he'd been constructing a space where I could create. A room designed specifically for the daughter, whose dreams he'd once dismissed as impractical fantasies. The rest of the day passed in a blur of casseroles and condolences, neighbors stopping by the house with food and memories, and offers to help with whatever needed doing. I moved through the conversations like an actor playing a role, responding appropriately to kind words, and shared stories while my mind remained fixed on the key in my pocket and the workshop that waited for me behind Thompson Auto Repair. It wasn't until evening, after the last visitor had left, and Mom had finally agreed to rest, that I found myself walking down Main Street toward the shop. The familiar blue and white sign glowed under the streetlights, and the building looked solid and permanent against the darkening sky, like something that had always been there, and always would be. I used my old key to enter through the front office, breathing in the scent of motor oil and coffee, and the indefinable smell of honest work that had defined my childhood. Dad's desk sat exactly as he'd left it, covered with invoices and repair estimates, and the daily detritus of running a small business. Behind it, on a shelf I'd never paid attention to before, sat a cardboard box labeled Maya in Dad's careful handwriting. The box contained everything Jake had described, and more. Articles about Morrison Graphics, printouts of my company bio and portfolio samples, photographs of campaigns I'd forgotten I'd worked on, even a copy of the college newspaper article that had featured my senior project. Dad had been documenting my career more thoroughly than I had, collecting evidence of my success like a proud parent filling a scrapbook. At the bottom of the box, I found a folder marked Workshop Plans, containing detailed sketches and measurements, supply lists and contractor estimates, all dated over the past 2 years. Dad had planned every aspect of the space, with the same methodical precision he brought to engine repairs, considering everything from lighting and electrical outlets, to storage solutions and ventilation systems. The plans showed a converted garage bay, equipped with professional-grade drafting tables, computer workstations, a presentation area with wall-mounted monitors, and storage for art supplies and project materials. He'd included specifications for a coffee station, comfortable seating for client meetings, and large windows that would fill the space with natural light. It was a designer's dream studio, planned by someone who'd clearly researched what creative professionals needed in their work environments. I found the workshop key fit into a door I'd never noticed before, hidden behind a stack of tire displays in the rear corner of the main garage. The door opened onto a space that took my breath away, a professionally designed studio that looked like something from the pages of an architecture magazine. Every detail matched the plans I'd seen, from the custom-built storage units to the high-end computer equipment that must have cost more than Dad's annual vacation budget. The walls were painted a soft gray that would showcase artwork without competing for attention, and track lighting provided even illumination throughout the space. 3 large drafting tables occupied the center of the room, surrounded by ergonomic chairs and mobile supply carts. A presentation wall featured multiple monitors and a projection system that would allow for client meetings and design reviews. But the most surprising element was personal, rather than professional. Dad had commissioned a local artist to create a mural along one wall, a stylized representation of Millbrook's Main Street that incorporated elements from my portfolio work. The animal shelter logo I'd designed was subtle integrated into a storefront sign, and the typography from a nonprofit campaign I'd created formed part of the street signage. It was like seeing my professional life translated into the visual language of home, my Chicago achievements celebrated in the context of where I'd started. A small refrigerator hummed quietly in one corner, stocked with the expensive coffee I preferred, and the sparkling water I'd developed a taste for during my city years. A bookshelf held reference materials about design and marketing, all of them recent purchases based on the receipt I found tucked inside one of the covers. Dad had been educating himself about my industry, learning the vocabulary and concepts that would allow him to understand my work on its own terms. On the main desk, positioned where I couldn't miss it, sat an envelope with my name written in Dad's familiar script. Inside, a single sheet of paper contained just a few lines. "Maya, this is where you belong when you're ready to belong somewhere. Not instead of Chicago, but in addition to it. Not instead of your dreams, but as part of them. I built this for the daughter who was brave enough to leave, and smart enough to know when it's time to come home. Love, Dad." I sat in the ergonomic chair at the main workstation, surrounded by evidence of love I'd never known existed, and tried to process the magnitude of what Dad had created for me. This wasn't just a workshop, it was an invitation, a bridge between the life I'd built and the family I'd left behind, a way to honor both my independence and my roots. The computer workstation was state-of-the-art, equipped with the same design software I used at Morrison Graphics and a monitor system that would allow for detailed color work and client presentations. Dad had somehow obtained the specifications for my Chicago setup and replicated it exactly, down to the custom keyboard I preferred, and the graphics tablet I used for hand-drawn elements. A portfolio case sat open on one of the drafting tables, filled with examples of local businesses that could benefit from professional design services. Dad had been researching potential clients, identifying opportunities where my skills could make a difference in the Millbrook community: restaurants that needed menu redesigns, retail shops with outdated signage, nonprofit organizations that could use help with their fundraising materials. The message was clear without being demanding. If I chose to spend time in Millbrook, there would be meaningful work waiting for me, projects that would allow me to contribute to the community that had shaped me while using the expertise I'd developed in Chicago. Dad had found a way to make both worlds possible simultaneously, to offer me a place at home without asking me to sacrifice what I'd built away from home. I spent 3 hours in that workshop, exploring every carefully planned detail, marveling at the depth of thought and research Dad had invested in creating the perfect creative space. He'd anticipated needs I didn't know I had, solved problems I hadn't yet encountered, and provided resources that would allow me to work more effectively than I could in my Chicago office. The workshop represented more than just a room, or even a gesture of reconciliation. It was proof that Dad had spent the last 2 years really seeing me, not as the stubborn 22-year-old who'd walked away from his plans for her future, but as the accomplished professional who'd built something meaningful from the dreams he'd once dismissed. He'd educated himself about my industry, invested in understanding my work, and created a space that honored both my expertise and my heritage. When I finally locked the workshop and walked back through the main garage, I noticed details I'd missed during my emotional tour earlier. New equipment, updated systems, improvements that suggested the business was thriving in ways that went beyond simple maintenance and repair. Jake had mentioned expansion plans, and now I could see evidence of Dad's investment in the shop's future, his commitment to growth and innovation that paralleled the workshop he'd built for me. Part 4. Understanding the foundation, the next morning, I woke early and walked to the shop before it opened, using my key to enter through the front office and make coffee in the break room that had been modernized since my teenage years. Mrs. Peterson's desk was organized with military precision, her computer displaying a scheduling system that would have impressed the efficiency experts at Morrison Graphics. The shop had evolved far beyond the informal operation I remembered, becoming a sophisticated small business that balanced traditional values with contemporary management practices. Jake arrived at 7:30, surprised to find me already there, but pleased by my presence. Couldn't stay away, he asked, hanging his jacket on the same hook Dad had used for 30 years. I found the workshop, I said simply. His face lit up with genuine excitement. What did you think? Dad must have shown me those plans 100 times, asking my opinion about everything from the lighting fixtures to the coffee machine. He wanted it to be perfect. It is perfect. Almost suspiciously perfect, like he'd been inside my brain taking notes about what I'd want in an ideal studio. I poured coffee for both of us, noting that Jake took his black like Dad always had. How did he know about the specific software I use, the equipment preferences, all those details? Jake laughed, the sound warm and slightly conspiratorial. Internet research mostly. But also, he may have called Morrison Graphics a few times, asking general questions about what professional designers need in their work environments. He told them he was considering hiring a consultant and wanted to understand the industry better. He called my company multiple times. He was thorough when he set his mind to something. Remember how he researched for 6 months before buying that new diagnostic computer? Same approach, but this time the project was understanding his daughter's career well enough to support it properly. Jake settled into Dad's chair behind the desk, looking natural in the role he'd apparently been filling for months. He also subscribed to those design magazines, the ones where your work gets featured sometimes, said he needed to learn the language of your profession, if he was going to have intelligent conversations with you about it. The image of Dad reading design magazines in his spare time, studying the industry that had taken his daughter away from him, was both touching and absurd. I could picture him sitting in his office during lunch breaks, looking up unfamiliar terms, and trying to understand why certain typefaces worked better for specific clients, approaching graphic design with the same systematic methodology he'd applied to automotive repair. Did he ever say why he waited so long to reach out? Why he built the workshop before sending the letter? Jake was quiet for a moment, organizing papers on the desk with unnecessary concentration. He was scared, he said finally. Scared you'd reject the gesture, scared you'd think he was trying to manipulate you into moving home, scared he'd mess up the reconciliation the same way he'd messed up the original relationship. So he built a workshop as practice for writing a letter. More like he built the workshop as proof that he meant what he was going to say in the letter. Dad was never good with words, but he was excellent with actions. The workshop was his way of demonstrating that he understood your value, that he respected your choices, that he wanted to support your dreams, even if he couldn't be part of them directly. The psychology made sense in a way that was quintessentially Dad. He'd always been more comfortable showing love than speaking it, more skilled at solving problems than discussing emotions. The workshop was his love language translated into terms I could understand, his apology rendered in wood and steel, and carefully researched equipment specifications. What happens to it now? I asked. To the workshop, I mean. That's up to you. Dad's will leaves the entire shop property to both of us jointly, which means we make decisions together about how to use the space. If you want to keep the workshop as a studio, we can do that. If you want to convert it back to garage space, that's fine too. If you want to sell your half of the property and wash your hands of the whole thing, I'll understand. The options Jake presented were all reasonable, but none of them felt complete. The workshop represented too much investment, too much hope, too much carefully planned reconciliation to simply abandon or ignore. Dad had created it as a bridge between my two worlds, and maybe it was time for me to consider whether I was ready to walk across that bridge. Tell me about the business, I said. Really tell me. Not just the polite summary for the prodigal daughter, but the actual state of things. What's working? What's not? What could be improved? Jake's expression shifted from familial politeness to professional engagement, and for the next hour he walked me through the shop's operations with the thoroughness of someone who'd been preparing for this conversation for years. The numbers were impressive, revenue and profit margins that exceeded what I'd expected from a small-town auto repair business. Dad had built something more substantial than I'd realized, an operation that served customers throughout the region and maintained relationships with suppliers and specialty service providers across the Midwest. The challenge isn't capacity or capability, Jake explained, pulling up financial reports on the office computer. It's visibility. We have more work than we can handle from existing customers, but we're not reaching new markets that could use our services. Classic car restoration, custom modification work, specialty repairs that require our level of expertise, but pay premium rates. Marketing problem, I said automatically, my professional instincts engaging before I'd consciously decided to offer input. Exactly. Dad was old school about advertising, figured word of mouth and reputation were enough, and they were, for the kind of steady business that paid the bills and kept the lights on. But if we want to grow, if we want to build something that could support families, and maybe even become a destination for car enthusiasts, we need to think bigger. The conversation continued as customers began arriving for their appointments, and I found myself observing the shop's operations with fresh eyes. The work quality was exceptional, the customer service genuine and thorough, but the presentation was dated in ways that probably cost them business with younger customers who research service providers online before making decisions. Mrs. Peterson arrived at 9, greeting me with warm efficiency, and immediately pulling out a folder that contained what she described as your father's Maya materials. The folder held not just the articles Jake had mentioned, but also printed emails Dad had sent to various professional organizations, inquiring about continuing education opportunities that would help him understand modern business practices and customer relationship management. He wanted to be ready, Mrs. Peterson explained, her voice carrying the fondness of someone who'd worked with Dad long enough to understand his complicated motivations, ready to have intelligent conversations about your work, ready to support your career if you ever gave him the chance, ready to demonstrate that he'd learned from his mistakes and grown into someone worthy of your forgiveness. The evidence of Dad's transformation was overwhelming and humbling. He'd spent years educating himself about subjects that didn't come naturally to him, investing time and energy in becoming the kind of person who could bridge the gap between his world and mine. The workshop was just the most visible manifestation of a deeper change, a fundamental shift in how he understood success and family, and the relationship between dreams and responsibility. Around noon, Uncle Eddie stopped by with a thermos of coffee and a brown bag, containing what he claimed were the best sandwiches in Millbrook. We sat in the workshop while he told me stories about Dad's transformation over the past few years, his gradual evolution from the rigid man who'd issued ultimatums to the thoughtful father who'd spent weekends researching graphic design software and reading articles about work-life balance in creative industries. He never said he was wrong about letting you go, Eddie said, unwrapping a sandwich that smelled like heaven and tasted even better. But he did say he was wrong about how he let you go, wrong about the words he used and the anger he carried, wrong about making it seem like love had conditions that you'd failed to meet. Did he ever talk about reaching out earlier? About trying to contact me before the heart problem started? Eddie nodded slowly, chewing thoughtfully before answering. Every Christmas, every birthday, every time your name came up in conversation, he'd talk about calling you, about writing a letter, about finding some excuse to visit Chicago, and maybe running into you accidentally, but then he'd talk himself out of it, convinced that you were better off without the complication of reconciling with an old man who'd hurt you badly enough to drive you away. That's ridiculous, I would have answered if he'd called. Would you have, really? Eddie's question was gentle but pointed. Or would you have been polite and distant, protective of the new life you'd built, suspicious of his motivations for contacting you after so many years of silence? The honesty was uncomfortable, because I wasn't sure of the answer. The Maya who'd left Millbrook 12 years ago had been angry and wounded and determined to prove herself without help from anyone who doubted her potential. If Dad had called during those early years in Chicago, when I was working 16-hour days and sleeping on a friend's couch and eating ramen noodles for dinner more often than I cared to admit, I might have interpreted his contact as interference rather than support. He knew you needed time to become who you were meant to be, Eddie continued. Time to build your own foundation, develop your own confidence, create your own definition of success that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. He respected that process even though it meant staying away from someone he loved more than his own life. The conversation with Eddie lasted until mid-afternoon, covering not just Dad's evolution but also the broader changes in Millbrook over the past decade. The town was slowly attracting young families who wanted small-town life but worked remotely for companies in larger cities, and several new businesses had opened to serve this emerging demographic. The market for sophisticated services was growing, creating opportunities for businesses that could bridge traditional values with contemporary expectations. Your dad saw it happening, Eddie said as we prepared to close up the workshop. Saw the potential for growth, for attracting customers who'd pay premium prices for premium service. He just didn't know how to reach those customers effectively, how to communicate the quality of what he offered in ways that would resonate with people who made decisions based on online reviews and social media presence. Classic marketing challenge, I murmured, already thinking about strategies that could work for a business like Thompson Auto Repair. Exactly what he said. This is a marketing challenge, and marketing is Maya's specialty. If she ever comes home, she'll know how to help us grow the right way, reach the right customers, build something even bigger than what we have now. Eddie smiled at the memory. He had complete faith in your abilities, even when he didn't understand what those abilities were. Part 5. The first real connection that evening, I sat in the workshop until well past dark, sketching ideas for Thompson Auto Repair's marketing strategy with the same enthusiasm I'd felt for my biggest Morrison Graphics campaigns. The creative challenge was engaging and complex, requiring me to balance the shop's traditional values with contemporary communication methods to honor Dad's legacy while positioning the business for future growth. The work felt different from anything I'd done in Chicago, more personal and meaningful because success would benefit people I cared about rather than just clients who paid well. Every strategic decision carried emotional weight, every design choice reflected not just professional expertise but also family history and community connection. I started with a comprehensive brand audit, analyzing how Thompson Auto Repair currently presented itself to potential customers and identifying gaps between the shop's actual capabilities and public perception. The existing website was functional but uninspiring, the social media presence minimal, the customer communications professional but impersonal. Everything suggested competence without conveying the passion and dedication that actually drove the business. The solution required more than just updated graphics and improved online presence. Dad had built something special, a business that combined technical expertise with genuine care for customers and community, but that specialness was hidden behind modest. Part 3. Returning to the workshop. The solution required more than just updated graphics and improved online presence. Dad had built something special, a business that combined technical expertise with genuine care for customers and community, but that specialness was hidden behind modest presentations and outdated communication methods. The real Thompson Auto Repair story needed to be told in ways that would resonate with both longtime customers and the growing market of professionals who valued quality service delivered with integrity. I worked until midnight, developing concepts that celebrated the shop's heritage while positioning it for expansion into specialty services like classic car restoration and custom modification work. The Morrison Graphics training kicked in automatically, my hands moving across the drafting paper with practiced efficiency, while my mind processed brand strategy and target market analysis and competitive positioning studies. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using skills Dad had once dismissed to solve problems that could secure his business's future for decades. Every line I drew, every color palette I considered, every typography choice I evaluated represented the convergence of two worlds that had seemed incompatible 12 years ago but now felt naturally complementary. Around 1 in the morning, Jake found me still working in the workshop, surrounded by sketches and notes and the debris of intensive creative problem solving. He knocked softly on the door frame before entering, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the expression of someone who'd been hoping to find exactly what he'd discovered. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, settling into one of the client chairs Dad had included in the workspace design. "Too much to process," I admitted, gesturing at the collection of materials spread across the drafting tables. "All of this, Dad's letter, the workshop, the business opportunities I'm seeing everywhere I look, it's like someone turned on lights in a room I didn't know existed." Jake examined my sketches with genuine interest, his expression shifting from polite curiosity to engaged enthusiasm as he recognized the scope and sophistication of what I'd been developing. "This is incredible, Maya. These aren't just logo updates or website improvements. This is a complete business transformation strategy. It started as just sketching to process my emotions, but then I realized how much potential the shop has that's not being maximized. Dad built an amazing foundation, but foundations are meant to support something bigger, something that can grow and evolve and serve more people in more ways. Show me what you're thinking." For the next 2 hours, I walked Jake through my preliminary analysis of Thompson Auto Repair's market position and growth opportunities. The business was perfectly positioned to become a regional destination for specialty automotive services, with Dad's reputation for quality work serving as the foundation for expansion into higher-margin services that would attract customers from throughout the Midwest. The classic car restoration market was particularly promising, with wealthy collectors willing to pay premium prices for expertise and craftsmanship that preserved original specifications while incorporating modern safety and performance improvements. Dad had always been meticulous about maintaining historical accuracy in his repair work, and the shop's existing relationships with specialty parts suppliers could be leveraged to support full restoration projects. Custom modification work represented another significant opportunity, especially with the growing market of younger car enthusiasts who wanted to personalize their vehicles while maintaining reliability and legal compliance. The shop's combination of technical expertise and attention to detail would appeal to customers who'd been burned by less careful operators who prioritized flashy results over engineering integrity. "The key is positioning," I explained, spreading out a series of brand concept sketches that ranged from traditional to contemporary. "We're not just Thompson Auto Repair anymore, we're Thompson Automotive Solutions, or Thompson Classic Restoration, or maybe Thompson Heritage Motors, something that captures the evolution from basic service to comprehensive automotive expertise." Jake studied the concepts with the focused attention of someone who understood that these weren't just creative exercises but potential blueprints for his professional future. "Dad would have loved this," he said eventually. "Not just the business strategy, but seeing you apply your talents to something that mattered to him personally. The workshop makes more sense now. He wasn't just creating a space for me to visit occasionally. He was building the infrastructure for a partnership, a way for my skills to contribute to the family business without requiring me to abandon everything I'd built in Chicago. Could you see yourself doing that? Splitting time between here and Chicago, using this as a base for freelance work while helping grow the shop into something bigger?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with possibilities that I hadn't allowed myself to consider seriously until that moment. The workshop represented more than just Dad's apology or even his respect for my career choices. It was an invitation to build something together, to create a future that honored both tradition and innovation, both family history and individual ambition. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I'm starting to think about it, which is more than I ever expected when I drove up here yesterday." "Take your time. Dad spent 2 years planning the workshop, and he would have waited 2 more if that's what it took for you to be ready. The opportunities aren't going anywhere, and the shop will still be here whenever you decide what you want your relationship with it to be." We cleaned up the workspace in comfortable silence, organizing my sketches and notes into folders that could be reviewed more systematically later. The creative process had been therapeutic as well as productive, allowing me to channel grief and confusion into something constructive and forward-looking. For the first time since arriving in Millbrook, I felt like I was moving towards something rather than just processing loss. The drive back to the house took me past landmarks that had defined my childhood geography, places that seemed both smaller and more significant than I remembered. The elementary school where I'd learned to read, the library where I'd discovered art books that expanded my understanding of what creativity could accomplish, the park where Dad had taught me to ride a bicycle with the same patient persistence he brought to training new mechanics. Millbrook hadn't changed dramatically in 12 years, but my perspective on it had shifted completely. What I'd once seen as limitations now looked like foundations, and what I'd interpreted as resistance to growth now seemed like commitment to values that were worth preserving even as circumstances evolved. The house was quiet when I arrived, Mom and Jake both asleep, but I wasn't ready for bed despite the late hour and emotional exhaustion of the day. I made tea in the kitchen where Dad and I had argued 12 years ago, sitting at the same table but feeling like a completely different person than the angry young woman who'd issued ultimatums about dreams and disappointment. Part 4. Understanding the Foundation. The morning brought clarity that had been missing during the emotionally charged days since Dad's death. I woke early, made coffee and sat on the back porch watching the sunrise paint the familiar landscape in shades of gold and amber that reminded me why I'd once thought this place was the most beautiful in the world. Mom joined me around 7, wearing the same grateful expression she'd shown since I'd arrived, like she was afraid I might disappear again if she stopped watching me carefully. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking coffee and observing the gradual transition from night to day that had marked thousands of mornings in this same spot. I went through Dad's files yesterday, I said eventually. All the research he did about my industry, all the planning for the workshop, all the evidence that he'd been thinking about reconciliation for years before he actually reached out. He never stopped missing you, Mom said simply, not for a single day. But he also never stopped being proud of you for having the courage to leave when staying would have meant giving up who you were meant to become. Why didn't you push him to contact me sooner? You could have convinced him to swallow his pride and pick up the phone. Mom smiled sadly, stirring her coffee with unnecessary attention to detail. Because I understood something your father took longer to learn. You needed to know that when he reached out it was because he'd genuinely changed, not because I'd nagged him into pretending to change. Real reconciliation required real transformation, and that couldn't be rushed or faked or forced. The wisdom was characteristic of Mom, who'd always been better at reading emotional undercurrents and understanding the complex psychology of family relationships. She'd probably spent 12 years managing Dad's grief and guilt while protecting my right to build an independent life, serving as a buffer between two people she loved who couldn't figure out how to love each other across the distance they'd created. What did you think about his workshop plan? Did you believe it would work? I thought it was the most hopeful thing I'd seen him do in years, Mom said without hesitation, not because I expected you to move home and take over the business, but because it meant he'd finally learned to express love in ways that honored your choices, rather than demanding that you change them. And if I'd never come back, if he'd died without us reconciling, then at least he would have died knowing he'd done everything he could to build bridges instead of walls. The workshop would have been a monument to love and regret and hope, which seemed like a better legacy than the bitterness and stubbornness that defined too many of his relationships over the years. We were interrupted by the arrival of Eddie's pickup truck, loaded with what appeared to be furniture and boxes covered by a paint-splattered tarp. He parked near the back porch and emerged wearing work clothes and the cheerful expression of someone who was looking forward to a productive day of physical labor. "Morning, ladies," he called, lowering the truck's tailgate with practiced efficiency. "Maya, I brought some things your dad had been storing at my place, said I should give them to you if anything ever happened to him." The boxes contained artifacts from my childhood and adolescence that Dad had apparently preserved long after I'd assumed they'd been discarded or forgotten. Art projects from elementary school, carefully mounted and protected in plastic sleeves. High school portfolio pieces that had helped me get into college, organized chronologically to show the development of my skills and artistic vision over time. Even rough sketches and doodles from notebooks and margins, evidence that my creative impulses had been constant and irrepressible from an early age. He used to look through these sometimes, Eddie explained as we carried the boxes into the house. Especially after Jake would update him about some new success you'd had in Chicago. Said it helped him remember that your talent had been obvious from the beginning, that he should have recognized and encouraged it instead of worrying about whether it would lead to financial security. The collection was comprehensive and carefully curated, spanning nearly 15 years of creative development from childhood experiments with crayons and construction paper to sophisticated design projects that had won state-level competitions during my senior year of high school. Dad had kept everything, creating an archive of my artistic evolution that was more complete than anything I'd maintained myself. "Look at this," Mom said, pulling out a folder labeled Maya's business plans in Dad's handwriting. Inside were copies of assignments from my entrepreneurship class, projects where I'd developed marketing strategies for imaginary companies and created brand identities for fictional clients. He studied these like they were textbooks, trying to understand how your mind worked when you approached business problems. The folder also contained printed pages from websites and articles about successful graphic designers who'd built their own agencies, case studies of creative professionals who'd balanced artistic integrity with commercial success. Dad had been researching not just my industry but also the specific path I'd chosen within it, educating himself about the challenges and opportunities that defined freelance creative work. "He wanted to be able to have intelligent conversations with you about your career," Eddie said, settling into Dad's favorite chair in the living room. "Wanted to understand your world well enough to offer meaningful support instead of just generic encouragement that showed how little he really knew about what you did all day." The depth of Dad's preparation was both touching and overwhelming. He'd approached reconciliation with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to complex automotive repairs, researching every aspect of the challenge and developing comprehensive plans for achieving the desired outcome. The workshop hadn't been an impulsive gesture or simple peace offering, but rather the culmination of years of study and preparation and careful consideration of what would actually be helpful rather than just symbolically significant. Around noon, Jake arrived with sandwiches and the news that several customers had asked about memorial services or ways to honor Dad's memory through the business. The suggestions ranged from establishing a scholarship fund for local students interested in automotive careers, to creating a vintage car show that would celebrate the passion for classic automobiles that had defined so much of Dad's professional life. "Mrs. Patterson from the Historical Society thinks we should apply for grants to document the shop's history," Jake said, spreading lunch across the kitchen table. "Apparently there's funding available for preserving the stories of family businesses that have contributed to small-town economic stability over multiple generations." The idea was intriguing, especially considering the materials I'd discovered in Dad's files and the additional artifacts Eddie had brought from storage. The Thompson family business represented more than just automotive repair, it was a case study in adaptation and persistence and the evolution of small-town commerce over several decades. "We could create a multimedia presentation," I found myself saying, the possibilities expanding in my mind like time-lapse photography. Oral history interviews with longtime customers, photographs of the shop's transformation over the years, examples of significant repairs or restoration projects that showcase the expertise Dad built over 3 decades. "Marketing opportunity too," Jake added with a grin that reminded me of Dad at his most strategically minded. "Nothing builds credibility like documented history and community recognition. Customers want to do business with people they trust, and trust comes from proven track records and community integration. Plus, it would give you a reason to spend extended time in Millbrook while working on a project that honors Dad's memory and contributes to the business's long-term success," Mom said with the subtle manipulation skills that had made her such an effective parent and marriage partner. The suggestion was transparent but appealing, a way to extend my visit without making permanent commitments that might prove premature or unrealistic. The historical documentation project would require several weeks of research and interviews and content development, providing structure for an extended stay while allowing me to contribute meaningfully to both family healing and business development. I'd need to arrange a leave of absence from Morrison, I said, thinking through the practical implications. But I have enough vacation time and project flexibility that a month or 6 weeks wouldn't be impossible to manage. Is that something you'd want to do? Jake asked, his tone carefully neutral in a way that reminded me of Dad's approach to sensitive negotiations. Yeah, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I think it is. Part 5. The first real connection. That afternoon, I called Morrison Graphics and spoke with my director about taking an extended leave for family reasons, explaining the situation in terms that emphasized both the personal importance of the project and its potential value as a case study in small business marketing and community engagement. The conversation went better than expected, with my director expressing sympathy for my loss and enthusiasm for the documentation project's potential to generate insights that could benefit other Morrison clients. Take the time you need, Sarah Martinez said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who'd lost her own father several years earlier. Family business stories are gold mines for understanding authentic brand development and community-based marketing strategies. Document everything, and we'll figure out how to incorporate your findings into our methodology when you're ready to come back. The professional validation made the decision feel less like abandonment of my career responsibilities and more like expansion of my expertise into new areas that could enhance my value to Morrison while serving my family's immediate needs. The boundary between personal and professional motivation was blurring in ways that felt natural rather than compromising. With the leave of absence secured, I spent the evening developing a project plan for the historical documentation work, outlining interview schedules and content development timelines and distribution strategies that would maximize the material's impact for both commemorative and marketing purposes. The creative challenge was engaging and multifaceted, requiring skills I'd developed over years of commercial work while addressing emotional needs that were entirely personal. Jake joined me in the workshop around 8, bringing coffee and Chinese takeout from the restaurant that had replaced the pizza place I remembered from high school. We spread the food across one of the drafting tables and continued developing plans for both the historical project and the broader business development strategy that was emerging from our conversations over the past few days. I've been thinking about the classic car restoration opportunity, Jake said between bites of Lomian. Dad always said the profit margins were better on specialty work, but he never pursued it aggressively because he didn't want to turn away regular customers who needed basic service and repairs. Capacity management issue, I said automatically, but solvable if you're willing to invest in additional space and personnel. The regular repair business provides steady cash flow and community relationships, while the restoration work provides higher margins and regional reputation building. 2 revenue streams, 2 customer bases, but shared infrastructure and expertise. Exactly. Plus, the restoration work showcases the shop's capabilities in ways that attract customers for regular services. People who see you do amazing work on a 1967 Mustang are going to trust you with their daily driver maintenance. We spent 2 hours developing business models that could support both service lines simultaneously, calculating space requirements and staffing needs and equipment investments that would position Thompson Auto Repair for sustainable growth over the next decade. The numbers were encouraging, suggesting that moderate expansion could double revenue within 3 years while maintaining the quality standards and community focus that had built Dad's reputation. The documentation project could serve as content for the business development marketing. I realized connections forming in my mind between the historical preservation work and commercial applications. Customer testimonials, case studies of significant repairs, demonstrations of expertise that build credibility with potential restoration clients. Kill 2 birds with 1 stone, more like feed 2 birds with 1 handful of seeds. Nothing gets killed, everything gets stronger. Jake laughed at the correction, recognizing the optimistic worldview that had always characterized my approach to problem solving even during the angry years when I'd thought optimism was naive. The workshop conversation was the longest substantive discussion we'd had since I'd arrived in Millbrook, and it felt like the beginning of an adult relationship based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than just family obligation. Maya, Jake said as we cleaned up the takeout containers and prepared to close the workshop for the evening. I want you to know that having you here, working on these projects, thinking about the business's future, it's the first time since Dad died that I've felt excited about anything instead of just sad and overwhelmed. Same here, I admitted. I came back expecting to get through a funeral and escape as quickly as possible. Instead, I'm discovering possibilities I never knew existed, connections I didn't realize I wanted. Think you might want to make some of those possibilities permanent. Not immediately, not without taking time to consider all the implications, but eventually. The question was direct but not pressuring, inviting honest consideration without demanding immediate commitment. Jake had learned diplomatic skills that probably came from years of managing Dad's relationships with difficult customers and suppliers, knowing how to ask for what he wanted without creating defensive responses. I think I want to finish the documentation project first, I said carefully. See how it feels to spend several weeks here working on something meaningful, rebuilding relationships with the community. If that goes well, if it feels sustainable and fulfilling, then maybe we can talk about longer-term arrangements. Fair enough. No pressure, no expectations, no ultimatums about choosing between different versions of your future. The contrast with Dad's approach 12 years earlier was stark and intentional. Jake's way of demonstrating that he'd learned from family history and wouldn't repeat the mistakes that had cost us so much time and connection. The conversation ended with tentative plans and mutual enthusiasm, the kind of conclusion that opens doors without forcing anyone to walk through them immediately. That night, I sat in my childhood bedroom writing in a journal I'd started during the drive from Chicago, trying to process the emotional complexity of the past few days and the unexpected directions my life seemed to be taking. The grief for Dad was still raw and overwhelming, but it was being joined by other feelings that were harder to name: gratitude for his final gestures of love and respect, excitement about creative projects that combined personal meaning with professional challenge. Curiosity about what life might look like if I allowed myself to imagine futures that included both Chicago and Millbrook. The letter Dad had written sat on my nightstand, reread several times as I tried to absorb the full implications of everything he'd revealed about his transformation over the past few years. The man who'd written those words was fundamentally different from the one who'd issued ultimatums about dreams and disappointment, evolved in ways that suggested real growth rather than just tactical changes.
Designed to achieve reconciliation, I wrote in the journal until nearly 2 in the morning, exploring questions that didn't have easy answers but seemed worth examining carefully. What did I want my relationship with family and home to look like going forward? How could I honor both my independence and my connections, both my professional achievements and my personal history? What would Dad think about the plans Jake and I were developing, about the ways we were building on his foundation while expanding beyond his original vision? The writing process was therapeutic and clarifying, helping me organize thoughts and feelings that had been swirling chaotically since I'd received the phone call about Dad's death. By the time I finally turned off the light and tried to sleep, I felt more grounded and purposeful than I had since arriving in Millbrook, ready to begin the real work of rebuilding relationships and creating new possibilities from the ruins of old misunderstandings. The documentation project would start tomorrow, beginning with interviews with longtime customers who could speak to Dad's impact on their lives and the community's economic development over the past 3 decades. The work would be challenging and emotionally demanding, requiring me to see Dad through other people's eyes while processing my own complicated feelings about his legacy and the opportunities he'd created for building something meaningful from loss. But for the first time since I'd pulled over on Highway 31 to read Jake's devastating text message, I felt ready for the challenges ahead, equipped with both professional skills and personal motivation to create something worthy of the love and effort Dad had invested in preparing for a reconciliation he wouldn't live to see completed. Part 4.
The complete circle. 6 months later, I stood in the newly expanded Thompson Heritage Motors workshop, watching 16-year-old Emma Patterson put the finishing touches on a marketing brochure for her family's organic farm stand. She'd been coming to our community design workshops every Saturday since we'd launched the program in May, part of a youth mentorship initiative that combined business education with practical creative skills training. The typography needs to be more readable from a distance, I suggested, leaning over her shoulder to examine the layout on her computer screen. Remember, people driving by the farm stand need to be able to process your message in just a few seconds. Emma nodded seriously, making adjustments with the focused concentration of someone who'd discovered a genuine passion for visual communication. She reminded me of myself at that age, hungry for knowledge and eager to turn creative impulses into something that could make a real difference in the world around her. The workshop buzzed with productive energy as 12 local teenagers worked on projects for actual small businesses throughout the region. What had started as a way to honor Dad's memory had evolved into a comprehensive program that served both educational and economic development purposes, teaching valuable skills while helping local entrepreneurs improve their marketing effectiveness on budgets they could actually afford. "Maya, can you look at this color palette?" called Marcus Chen, a 17-year-old whose parents owned the Chinese restaurant where Jake and I had gotten takeout during those first planning sessions. "I can't decide if the contrast is strong enough for accessibility standards." The question pleased me because it demonstrated that Marcus had internalized the professional principles we'd been teaching about inclusive design and social responsibility. These kids weren't just learning technical skills, they were developing ethical frameworks for using their talents in ways that served their communities rather than just their own advancement. I moved between workstations, offering guidance and feedback while marveling at how naturally the mentorship role had developed over the past few months. Teaching had never been part of my career plans, but working with these young designers felt like the most meaningful professional work I'd ever done, combining creative problem-solving with genuine community impact in ways that corporate campaigns had never achieved. The workshop occupied the space that had originally been planned as my private studio, but we'd discovered that sharing the resources multiplied their value exponentially. Instead of one designer working on projects for distant clients, we now had a dozen emerging designers learning to serve local businesses while developing skills that would prepare them for careers in creative industries or entrepreneurial ventures of their own. Thompson Heritage Motors had exceeded every projection we'd made during those late-night planning sessions in the spring. The classic car restoration division was booked solid through the following year, with projects ranging from complete frame-off restorations to custom modifications that preserved historical authenticity while incorporating modern safety and performance improvements. Jake had hired 2 additional mechanics who specialized in vintage automobiles, and we'd converted the old storage building into a climate-controlled facility for long-term restoration projects. The regular automotive service business had grown alongside the specialty work, benefiting from the enhanced reputation and increased visibility that came with serving collectors and enthusiasts throughout the Midwest. Our customer base now included everyone from local farmers who needed basic maintenance to wealthy executives who flew their vintage Porsches in from Chicago for our restoration expertise. But the most satisfying aspect of the business transformation wasn't financial success or professional recognition. It was the way the workshop had become a community gathering place, a hub for creativity and learning, an intergenerational connection that served purposes Dad had never imagined when he'd planned the original space. Mrs. Peterson had suggested the youth program after watching me work with Emma on her first freelance project, recognizing that Millbrook's teenagers needed access to modern skills training that wasn't available through traditional educational channels. The local high school offered basic computer classes but nothing approaching professional-level design education, leaving creative kids with limited options for developing their talents without leaving town for college. The program had started small, just 3 students meeting on Saturday mornings to work on projects for their families' businesses. But word had spread quickly through the community, and we'd soon had a waiting list of teenagers who wanted to learn graphic design, web development, and digital marketing skills that would serve them regardless of their ultimate career choices. Local business owners had embraced the program enthusiastically, offering real projects that provided authentic learning experiences while helping them access professional quality design services at prices they could afford. The arrangement benefited everyone involved, creating a sustainable model for ongoing community development that combined education with economic support. "Maya, we've got a problem," Jake announced, entering the workshop with an expression that mixed concern with barely suppressed excitement. "Good problem, but still a problem." I looked up from the color theory lesson I'd been conducting with 3 students who were working on a rebranding project for the local library. "What kind of good problem?" Automotive Restoration magazine wants to do a feature story about Thompson Heritage Motors, full-spread professional photography, the works. They're particularly interested in our community workshop program and how we're combining traditional craftsmanship with youth education initiatives. The news was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. National recognition would bring tremendous opportunities for business growth and program expansion, but it would also mean scrutiny and expectations that could fundamentally change the intimate family-centered culture we'd worked so hard to create. "When do they want to visit?" I asked, my mind already racing through the implications and preparations that would be necessary. "Next month. They're planning to spend 3 days documenting our operations, interviewing customers and students, photographing the restoration projects we have in progress." The editor specifically mentioned wanting to understand how we've managed to honor traditional automotive craftsmanship while creating innovative educational opportunities. The students had stopped working to listen to our conversation, their faces reflecting the same mixture of excitement and nervousness I was feeling. Being featured in a national magazine would validate their efforts and potentially open doors to opportunities they'd never imagined, but it would also transform our quiet local program into something with much broader visibility and expectations. "What do you think, team?" I asked, addressing the question to everyone in the workshop. "Are we ready for this kind of attention?" Emma raised her hand with the confidence of someone who'd grown tremendously over the past few months. "I think we should do it, but only if we can control how they tell our story. We don't want them to make it seem like we're just playing around with design software. This is real work that's making a real difference." Marcus nodded enthusiastically. "Plus, it might inspire other communities to start similar programs. Think about how many talented kids there are in small towns who don't have access to this kind of training and mentorship." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with students and adult advisors weighing the potential benefits against the risks of increased exposure. The consensus was unanimous: we should participate in the magazine feature, but with clear boundaries about how our story would be presented and what aspects of our work would be emphasized. "I'll call them back and set up a preliminary conversation," Jake said. "We can establish ground rules and make sure they understand what we're trying to accomplish here before they commit to the article." After the students left for the day, Jake and I sat in the main office reviewing the week's business reports and planning schedules for the following month. The financial numbers continued to exceed expectations, but more importantly, the customer satisfaction ratings remained consistently excellent, and the workshop program was producing graduates who were already finding employment or starting their own creative businesses. "Dad would be amazed," Jake said, leaning back in the chair that had once been exclusively his. "Not just by the business growth, but by seeing how his workshop idea evolved into something that serves the whole community. He'd probably also be slightly overwhelmed by the attention and success," I replied, thinking about Dad's preference for quiet achievement over public recognition. "But I think he'd be proud of how we've managed to grow without losing the values that made the business special in the first place." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Uncle Eddie entered carrying a manila envelope and wearing the expression of someone who had important news to share. "Maya, this came for you today," he said, handing me the envelope with ceremonial gravity. "From the State Department of Economic Development, looks official." I opened the envelope carefully, finding a formal letter that took several readings to fully comprehend. The state was offering Thompson Heritage Motors a substantial grant to expand our youth education program, based on documentation they'd received about our community impact and innovative approach to workforce development in rural areas. The grant would provide funding for additional equipment, expanded workshop space, and stipends for student participants who demonstrated exceptional aptitude and commitment to the program. More significantly, it would establish Thompson Heritage Motors as a pilot site for similar initiatives throughout Michigan, with the potential for our model to be replicated in other small communities facing similar challenges with youth retention and economic development. "This is incredible," I said, showing the letter to Jake and Eddie. "They're not just funding our existing program, they're asking us to help design a statewide initiative based on what we've built here. How did they even know about us?" Jake asked, scanning the letter with growing excitement. "Professor Martinez," I realized, recognizing his influence even though his name wasn't mentioned directly in the grant documentation. "He's been following our progress through the Morrison Graphics case study I've been developing. He must have recommended us to his contacts in state government." The grant represented validation of everything we'd been working toward, official recognition that our combination of traditional craftsmanship and innovative education was creating genuine value for both individual participants and the broader community. But it also meant new responsibilities and expectations that would require careful planning to manage successfully. "We'll need to hire additional staff," I said, thinking through the practical implications, both for the expanded workshop program and for the consultation work with other communities. This could easily become a full-time operation that serves students and small businesses throughout the region. "Are you ready for that level of commitment?" Jake asked, his tone carefully neutral despite the obvious hope in his eyes. The question had been implicit in our conversations for months, but this was the first time either of us had addressed it directly. My leave of absence from Morrison Graphics had been extended twice, and everyone involved understood that a decision about permanent arrangements couldn't be postponed much longer. "I've been thinking about it constantly," I admitted. "Morrison has offered me a partnership track and the opportunity to open a Midwest satellite office, which would allow me to maintain my connection with the company while establishing a permanent base here in Millbrook." "That sounds perfect. It could be if we structure it correctly. Morrison gets access to the small business market research we've been developing, plus a testing ground for community-based marketing strategies. I get to keep working with clients I care about while building something meaningful here at home. And Thompson Heritage Motors becomes the flagship example of how creative industries can contribute to rural economic development." The conversation continued as we walked through the workshop, examining the space with new eyes as we considered how it might need to be modified to accommodate the expanded programming the grant would make possible. The current setup was perfect for 12 students, but we'd need to serve at least twice that number if we accepted the state's offer to become a regional center for workforce development innovation. "We could convert the old parts storage area into additional computer workstations," Jake suggested, pointing to the space that had been cleaned out when we'd implemented the new inventory management system. "And the loft area could become a presentation space for client meetings and program showcases. Plus, we'd need dedicated areas for different types of training," I added, visualizing how the workflow could be optimized for multiple simultaneous activities: web development, print design, photography, maybe even basic videography for social media content creation. The planning session lasted until well past closing time, as we developed increasingly elaborate visions for what Thompson Heritage Motors could become with adequate funding and strategic support. The possibilities seemed limitless, bounded only by our imagination and commitment to maintaining the personal relationships and community focus that had made the original program successful. Around 8 o'clock, Mom arrived with dinner from the new bistro that had opened downtown, part of the gradual gentrification that was transforming Millbrook from a struggling agricultural community into a destination for young professionals who valued small-town life but needed access to modern amenities and business opportunities. "I brought enough for an army," she announced, spreading containers across the conference table we'd installed for client meetings. "Figured you'd both be here late, planning ways to take over the world through automotive restoration and graphic design education. We ate dinner while continuing to discuss the grant opportunity and its implications for our family and community relationships. Mom listened with the engaged attention of someone who understood that these decisions would affect not just our professional lives, but also the broader question of whether the Thompson family would remain rooted in Millbrook for another generation. Your father always said the hardest part of building something worthwhile was knowing when you'd succeeded well enough to take on bigger challenges, she said, as we cleaned up the empty containers. Sounds like you've reached that point with Thompson Heritage Motors. Are you ready for us to become a statewide model for rural economic development? I asked, only half joking. This could mean a lot more attention, a lot more visitors, a lot more complexity in our daily operations. Honey, I've been watching this community struggle with economic decline for 20 years. If you and Jake have figured out a way to give young people reasons to stay here and build careers here, then I'm ready for whatever complications come with that success. The conversation was interrupted by my phone ringing with a call from Chicago. Morrison Graphics' senior partner was calling to discuss the satellite office proposal we'd been developing, and the timing felt particularly significant given the grant opportunity we'd just discovered. Maya, I've been reviewing your community engagement case studies, David Morrison said, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who'd recognized a significant business opportunity. What you've built in Millbrook represents exactly the kind of authentic market penetration we've been trying to achieve with our small business client development initiatives. I'm glad the documentation has been helpful, I replied, stepping into the workshop for privacy while Jake and Mom continued their conversation in the office. More than helpful, revolutionary. You've created a replicable model for how design services can contribute to community economic development while generating sustainable revenue streams. We want to license your methodology and establish similar satellite operations in comparable markets throughout the Midwest. The offer was more generous than anything I'd imagined when I'd first pitched the satellite office concept, providing not just support for my Millbrook operations, but also the opportunity to help establish similar programs in other communities facing comparable challenges with youth retention and small business development. What kind of timeline are you thinking about? I asked, my mind racing through the coordination that would be required to manage both the state grant and the Morrison expansion simultaneously. We could have pilot programs operational in 3 additional communities within 18 months, assuming we can find local partners with your combination of technical expertise and community connections. The state grant you mentioned provides perfect validation for the concept's viability and scalability. The conversation lasted 45 minutes, covering everything from revenue sharing arrangements to intellectual property considerations to quality control standards that would ensure consistent service delivery across multiple locations. By the time we hung up, I had a preliminary agreement that would position Thompson Heritage Motors as the flagship location for a regional network of community-based design education and business development centers. How did it go? Jake asked when I returned to the office, though my expression probably made the answer obvious. Morrison wants to turn our model into a multi-state initiative, I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. They're offering partnership terms that would make us the regional headquarters for small business design services and workforce development programming. And how do you feel about that? The question required careful consideration, because the answer would determine not just my professional future but also the direction of family relationships and community commitments that had become central to my sense of purpose and identity. I feel like Dad's workshop plan worked exactly the way he hoped it would, I said finally. Not because I came home and took over his business, but because he created space for me to discover how my career could serve something bigger than just individual advancement or financial success. So that's a yes to the partnership with Morrison and the grant application. That's a yes to building something here that honors Dad's legacy while creating opportunities for young people who deserve better options than choosing between staying home with limited prospects or leaving home to find meaningful work. Jake smiled with relief and excitement, recognizing that my answer represented not just a business decision but a commitment to remaining part of his life and Mom's life and the community that had shaped us both in ways we were still learning to appreciate. That evening I drove to Dad's grave for the first time since the funeral, bringing fresh flowers and the grant letter that I read aloud to his headstone as the sun set behind the cemetery's oak trees. The conversation felt natural and necessary, a way of including him in decisions that would fundamentally alter the legacy he'd spent 30 years building. "I think you'd like what we're planning," I said to the granite marker that bore his name and the dates that had defined his too short life. "It's bigger than anything you imagined, but it's built on the foundation you created. Traditional craftsmanship and honest work, and taking care of people who trust you with their problems." The wind rustled through the trees as I described the youth program, and the magazine feature, and the expansion plans that would transform Thompson Heritage Motors from a local auto shop into a regional center for innovation and education. I told him about the students who reminded me of myself at their age, hungry for opportunities and willing to work hard for the chance to build something meaningful. "Maya would be proud of you," I said, using the third person that felt appropriate for a conversation with someone who'd moved beyond the complexities of family relationships into whatever form of existence awaited beyond physical life. "She'd be proud that you figured out how to love her choices even when you didn't understand them, proud that you built bridges instead of walls, proud that you trusted her to find her way home when she was ready." The drive back to the house took me past the shop, where lights were still on in the workshop, and I could see Jake working late on something that was probably related to our expansion planning. The sight filled me with contentment and anticipation, the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong, doing exactly what you're meant to do. At home I found Mom reading in Dad's old chair, wearing his favorite cardigan, and looking peaceful in a way that suggested she'd found her own form of closure and acceptance. We talked until late about family and future, and the unexpected ways that loss can become transformation if you're willing to remain open to possibilities you never knew existed. "Your father spent the last 2 years of his life becoming the man he wished he'd been when you were 22, Mom said as we prepared for bed. "I think he'd consider that time well spent, especially seeing how it's allowed you to become the woman you were always meant to be." 6 months after arriving in Millbrook for what I'd expected to be a brief, obligatory funeral visit, I was home in ways that transcended geography or convenience. I was building something that mattered, contributing to a community that valued my talents, and honoring a relationship with Dad that had been transformed by understanding rather than terminated by death. The workshop sat ready for Monday morning's activities, equipped with tools and technology that would help 12 teenagers develop skills that could change their lives and serve their community. Thompson Heritage Motors was booked solid with restoration projects that honored automotive history while incorporating modern innovations. And Maya Thompson was exactly where she belonged, creating a future that honored the past while embracing possibilities that extended far beyond anything one small town in northern Michigan had ever imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.